She looked me straight in the eyes, like I was a stranger who had just walked in off the street. Her voice, cold and sharp like broken glass, sliced through me with just 3 words. "You are ungrateful." I had heard her yell before. I had even seen her cry, but never this. Never a sentence so cruel, so deliberate, that it made the air leave my lungs. I stood there frozen, hands trembling, not because of what she said, but because deep down, after everything I had done, she meant it. She truly believed I was ungrateful, and that's what broke me. Because no one, absolutely no one, saw what I had given up. They didn't see the nights I stayed awake while my friends slept peacefully in their warm beds. They didn't see the birthdays I skipped, the scholarships I refused, the dreams I buried so deep inside me that I stopped remembering they existed. I sacrificed my teenage years, my 20s, my sanity, to care for my younger brother. I fed him when he couldn't lift a spoon. I carried him when his legs stopped responding. I held his hand through pain that no child should ever know. And I did it out of love. But love, apparently, was not enough. People think sacrifice comes with applause. They imagine warm hugs and thank you cards. But sacrifice, real sacrifice, is invisible. It's silent. It happens behind closed doors, in bathrooms where you cry quietly so no one hears. It happens when your phone lights up with a message from a college friend you'll never see again because she moved on and you stayed behind. It happens when you watch the world through the window while holding a feeding tube, and you keep telling yourself, it's okay. One day they'll see. But that day never comes. Because somewhere along the way, I stopped being the daughter. I became the default nurse, the babysitter, the emotional sponge. And once you take on that role, people stop checking in on you. They assume you're strong. They assume you're built for this, that maybe you even enjoy it. So when my mother looked at me with disappointment instead of gratitude, it wasn't sudden. It was the final crack in a wall that had been crumbling for years. It was the confirmation that I had become invisible even to her, and I wanted to scream. I wanted to fall to the floor and beg her to remember the 12-year-old girl who gave up sleepovers and school dances because her little brother needed her. The 17-year-old who turned down a college scholarship because her mom cried at the thought of managing his condition alone. The 22-year-old who knew how to inject medication better than some nurses. The 25-year-old who hadn't kissed a boy, hadn't gone on a single date, because every moment was timed around his needs. But I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just stood there, nodding silently, while my heart broke in ways I couldn't explain. I wanted to believe she was just tired, overwhelmed, hurting like me. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was, she had grown to expect my sacrifice. She had built her world around it. And the moment I asked for something small, something as human as rest, or space, or the freedom to breathe, she saw it as betrayal, ungrateful. That word echoed in my mind for weeks. At the grocery store, when I hesitated to buy the cereal I liked because it felt selfish. Ungrateful. At night, when I thought about applying to that online course again. Ungrateful. Every time I smiled at a stranger or imagined a life beyond this one, that word came back to haunt me. And what made it worse was knowing that if I disappeared tomorrow, if I vanished without a trace, no one would say, she gave too much. They'd say, she left. They'd call me selfish. They'd write me off as the girl who couldn't handle it. Because caretakers aren't allowed to break. They're not allowed to want more. We're supposed to give and give and give, until there's nothing left. I remember once when I was 13, I saw a bird with a broken wing on the sidewalk outside our house. I ran to get help, but by the time I came back, it was gone. Probably dragged away by something bigger, stronger, faster. I cried for hours that day, and my mother told me to stop being dramatic. That's nature, she said. Weak things get eaten. That memory came back the night she called me ungrateful, because in that moment I realized I was the bird, and she had stopped trying to protect me a long time ago. No one warns you that love can turn into obligation, that devotion can mutate into resentment, that the people you break yourself for might one day look at the pieces and say, this isn't enough. And yet, even with all of this, I still loved her. I still wanted her approval. I still wanted to hear her say, "I see you. I see what you've done. I'm sorry." But that apology never came. So I did the only thing I could. I walked away from that room, from that sentence, from that version of myself that believed my worth was tied to how much I could endure. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew that if I stayed, I'd disappear. And deep down, I was tired of disappearing. My name is Laura Mendez. I'm 32 years old, and I live in a quiet corner of Lubbock, Texas. If you ever pass by the all-night diner off 34th Street, the one with the flickering sign and the smell of burnt coffee that never quite leaves, you might see me behind the counter. I wear a light blue apron and tie my hair in the same tired bun every shift. People see me refill coffee, take orders with a tired smile, and wipe down tables that never stay clean. To them, I'm just another night worker, one more face in the blur of late-night service. But what they don't see is everything I had to leave behind just to stand there. They don't see the ghost of who I used to be. I used to laugh more. I used to hum songs without realizing it. I used to walk with a bounce in my step like the world was mine for the taking. That version of me feels like a stranger now. Not because of age, but because life carved the softness out of me. Slowly, deliberately, until only the shell remained. I was never supposed to be a caretaker. That wasn't the plan. If you asked me when I was a child what I wanted to be, I would have said an artist. I loved to draw. I'd spend hours sketching faces from magazines, making up stories for each one. I thought maybe I'd move to Austin, study design, maybe even work for a company that made book covers. That was the dream. Small, honest, beautiful. But dreams have a funny way of slipping through your fingers when you're not even looking. I remember the exact day my life changed. I was 10. My brother had just been diagnosed, and the word muscular dystrophy didn't mean anything to me then. All I knew was that my mom looked more tired than usual, and my brother had started falling down more. We were sitting on the floor watching cartoons when he collapsed mid-laugh and couldn't get up. That laugh, it echoed in my mind for years after. That was the last time I heard him laugh without pain. After that, everything got quieter. Our home turned into a hospital. Bottles of pills replaced the cereal boxes on the kitchen counter. Ramps took over the front porch. The smell of antiseptic became part of the air. I didn't notice it all at once. It was gradual, like seasons changing. One day, I was a kid doing homework at the table. The next, I was learning how to inject medication, how to suction a feeding tube, how to recognize signs of respiratory distress before they turned deadly. My mom used to say I was a natural, that I had the touch, but I wasn't gifted. I was just scared. Scared that if I did something wrong, he would die. Scared that if I said no, I'd lose more than a childhood. I'd lose my family's love. So I said yes, over and over again, until it stopped being a choice. Even the way I dressed changed. I went from bright colors to muted tones, practical, easy to wash. My wardrobe wasn't about expressing myself. It was about preparing for whatever emergency the day might throw at me. Vomit, blood, tears. I needed clothes that could survive all three. And I did it all without complaint. Because complaining felt like betrayal. Because everyone around me seemed to believe that I was fine, that I was strong, that I was coping. I wasn't. I was surviving. And there's a big difference. Surviving feels like breathing underwater, like smiling while your chest burns because you don't want anyone to worry. You make jokes, you show up, you function, but inside, you're crumbling. You walk through each day like you're holding a secret in your pocket that no one can ever see. And you carry it so long, you start to forget what it feels like not to. There were moments, brief ones, when I'd forget. When I'd walk to the corner store alone and the wind would hit my face just right. And I'd think, maybe I could have a life. Maybe I could fall in love. Maybe I could study something, anything. Maybe I could wake up one day and not feel like I was running out of time. But those moments were dangerous because they gave me hope. And hope, when you're stuck, is a double-edged sword. It lifts you just enough to see the cage you're in. And then it cuts you when you realize the door's been locked from the outside. People at the diner ask me sometimes if I'm married. I smile and say no. I say I haven't found the right person. They laugh and tell me he'll come along when I least expect it. But what they don't know is that love, for me, was never just about finding someone. It was about finding a version of myself that was free to love, that wasn't burdened by guilt, that didn't flinch at the idea of choosing herself. I never got to be that version. Instead, I became the dependable one, the strong one, the girl who held everyone else's world together while hers quietly fell apart. And now, I serve coffee at midnight, in a city that never knew my name, to strangers who will never know my story. They see the smile, the neat uniform, the polite tone. They don't see the memories I carry in my back pocket like worn-out photos. They don't see the love I poured into a life that never poured anything back. I once had a customer leave a note on a napkin that said, "You have a very peaceful energy." I read it and almost laughed. Peace wasn't what they were feeling. It was silence, a practiced silence, the kind you master when your whole life has been about staying small, staying quiet, staying useful. Because if you stop, even for a moment, you might realize you don't know who you are outside of other people's needs. And that's the scariest part. When you've spent so long being what everyone else needs, the idea of becoming someone for yourself feels almost selfish, even dangerous. But what if it's not? What if underneath all the layers of sacrifice and guilt and silence, there's still a spark? Something untouched, something true. Sometimes, on my breaks, I still draw. I keep a little notebook in the back room, hidden behind the coffee filters. I sketch the faces of people who pass through the diner. I imagine their stories. I give them names, dreams, heartbreaks. And in those moments, I remember the girl I used to be, the one who believed in beautiful things. And for a split second, I let myself believe too, that maybe life isn't over, that maybe even after everything, there's still something left for me. Not as a caretaker, not as the strong one, but just as me. I was 9 years old the first time I realized that childhood was something I wasn't going to fully experience. Not the way my classmates did. Not the way it's supposed to happen, with scraped knees and bike rides and birthday parties where the only thing that mattered was cake and games. My childhood ended the moment my brother was born. At first, it was subtle. My mom came home from the hospital holding a baby boy with big brown eyes and a body that seemed too quiet. He didn't cry like most babies. He didn't move much either. Everyone said he was just calm, a peaceful baby. But even then, something felt different. My mom would stare at him for hours, her eyes distant, like she was searching for something in his face. My father had already left by then. Another story, another scar. It was just the three of us. By the time my brother turned 2, the word diagnosis became a permanent part of our vocabulary. Duchenne muscular dystrophy. I remember sitting in the corner of the room while my mother cried into her hands. The doctor's voice was calm but unrelenting. His muscles will slowly weaken. He'll lose the ability to walk. By adolescence, he may be in a wheelchair. There is no cure. I didn't understand what it meant, not entirely. But I understood the way my mother stopped speaking after that. I understood how she moved through the house like a ghost. I understood how her laughter disappeared and never came back. And slowly, I began to understand my role in the new script life had handed us. My name stopped being just Laura. I became the big sister, the helper, the one who knows how to calm him down, the one who can keep an eye on him for just a few minutes. But those minutes turned into hours, and the hours turned into full days. And no one ever really asked if I was okay with it. When I was 10, my mom went back to work part-time to cover hospital bills. She worked the early morning shift cleaning hotel rooms. That meant I was in charge from 6 a.m. until the school bus came at 7:45. I would wake up, make my brother's breakfast, help him go to the bathroom, and make sure he took his vitamins. Then I'd throw on my backpack and pray I wasn't late. Sometimes I was. Teachers didn't ask questions. They just marked me absent. By 11, I had memorized the names and doses of his medications. I knew how to check his temperature, how to massage his legs when he cried from the cramps. I started skipping after-school programs, birthday parties, even sleepovers. Every time someone invited me, my mother would glance over with tired eyes and say, "It would be better if you stayed. He's been restless lately." So I stayed, again and again. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being needed all the time. It sounds backwards. You're surrounded by people, you're useful, you're appreciated, or so they say. But deep down, you begin to disappear. Your needs vanish. Your voice softens. You learn to put yourself last so convincingly that eventually no one even remembers you had a first. And I didn't complain. Not because I didn't feel pain, but because I thought complaining made me selfish. Everyone else was struggling too, right? My mom worked double shifts, barely slept. My brother was the one in real pain. Who was I to ask for more? One memory that haunts me is from a school field trip when I was 12. It was to a science museum. I had never been, and I was excited. I packed my lunch the night before. I even laid out my clothes, my best jeans and a t-shirt with a cartoon astronaut. But that morning, my brother woke up with a fever. My mom looked at me while putting on her uniform and said, "I can't miss work today. Please stay home with him." She didn't ask. She just expected. I nodded like I always did. I watched the school bus drive past our house from the window. I remember sitting next to my brother, holding a damp towel to his forehead, pretending I didn't care, telling myself that I was needed here, that it was fine, that the museum would have been boring anyway. But that night, when I went to bed, I cried into my pillow so quietly it didn't make a sound. That was the first time I felt resentment. I hated that feeling. It made me feel dirty, like I was betraying the people I loved. But it was there, and once it appeared, it never fully left. The house was always filled with quiet tension. My mother and I didn't talk about emotions. We talked about tasks, what needed to be done, what was next. If I forgot something, like giving my brother his 3 p.m. medication, she wouldn't yell, she would just sigh. That long, tired sigh that said more than words ever could. It told me I had failed, that I wasn't trying hard enough, that I had one job and couldn't even do that right. I learned to hate that sigh. When my brother started using a wheelchair, I was 13. My arms grew strong from lifting him. My back ached at night, but I kept smiling. At school, no one knew what my life looked like after 3 p.m. They saw me as quiet, focused, kind. I had mastered the art of hiding. I laughed at the right jokes. I handed in my homework. I never caused trouble. I was forgettable in all the ways that kept teachers from asking questions. I told myself that was a good thing. By 14, I could no longer pretend I was a kid. I had stopped playing. I stopped drawing. My notebooks, once filled with doodles and fantasy stories, now held appointment reminders and medical notes. The word childhood became something that belonged to other people, like clothes I had outgrown but never wore. There's a pain that comes not from losing something, but from realizing you never had it. I never had the luxury of being carefree. I never had the time to be lost in thought, or to make stupid mistakes, or to fall apart without consequences. Every move I made had a weight. Every decision had someone else's well-being attached to it. And through all of this, my mother changed. Not all at once, but slowly. Her shoulders stayed hunched even when she wasn't tired. Her eyes were always scanning, always calculating the next crisis. She started relying on me more than she should have. She would say things like, "Thank God I have you," with a smile that felt like a chain around my neck. That smile haunted me, because it looked like love. It sounded like gratitude. But underneath it, there was expectation. A quiet contract. The message was clear. You can't leave. You can't fall. You are the one holding this together. And when a child believes that, it shapes everything. You stop dreaming. You stop hoping. You become a shadow of the person you might have been. And the worst part? No one notices, because you're doing such a good job pretending to be fine. By the time I turned 12, the lines between being a sister and being a second mother were so blurred, I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. My life had become a constant negotiation of time, energy, and emotional survival. But the most painful part wasn't the physical exhaustion or the lack of sleep. or even the relentless pressure of being perfect in the eyes of someone who never said thank you. The most painful part was watching my mother disappear in front of me, one day at a time, until the woman I once adored became a stranger who only spoke to me in instructions. She wasn't cruel, not in the way people think of cruelty. She didn't scream or hit or throw things. She just withdrew. She stopped laughing at jokes, stopped asking about my day, stopped noticing when I was hurting. Her presence became mechanical, there in body, absent in spirit. She'd sit at the kitchen table long after the dishes were done, staring at nothing. Her fingers twisted the hem of her worn-out blouse, her eyes always somewhere far away. She was grieving, I think, grieving the life she thought she'd have, the son she feared she'd lose, the version of herself she no longer recognized. And while she was grieving, I was growing up too fast. There were no bedtime stories, no comforting hugs when I had a bad dream. I started waking myself up for school, making my own breakfast, packing lunch for both me and my brother. I learned to measure time in medication schedules, physical therapy appointments, and ambulance response delays. I became fluent in the language of hospitals, bilirubin, degenerative, seizure threshold, terms no child should ever have to know. The worst days were the days my mother didn't speak at all. She'd come home from her cleaning job with that same blank stare, remove her shoes in silence, and go straight to her room. She'd shut the door behind her like the rest of us didn't exist. Those were the nights I cooked dinner, helped my brother use the toilet, and cleaned up after both of them without saying a word. I'd lie in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if anyone would notice if I wasn't there. I don't know when it became normal, but eventually I stopped expecting anything different. People from the outside always think neglect has to look violent, but in reality, it can be so quiet, so passive, that you start to think maybe it's your fault. Maybe you're the one who's too emotional, too sensitive. Maybe you're asking for too much. So you stop asking. You start shrinking your needs until they're barely visible. You don't complain when your mom forgets your birthday 2 years in a row. You don't get upset when she blames you for things that weren't your fault. Like the time my brother fell out of his chair while I was in the bathroom. I rushed back the moment I heard the crash, heart racing, terrified. My mother came running into the room and without hesitation turned to me and said, "Why weren't you watching him?" I was 12. I had gone to pee. But instead of explaining, I just stood there frozen, feeling like I had committed some unforgivable crime. The shame lodged itself in my chest like a stone I couldn't swallow. From that point on, I didn't leave him alone, not even to shower. I'd keep the door open, towel wrapped around me, ear straining for any sound that might mean he needed me. I trained myself to hear him breathe in his sleep from the next room. I developed a sixth sense for when something was wrong. And still, somehow, it never felt like enough. When I did something right, there was silence. When I made a mistake, there was judgment. But never a thank you. Never a moment where someone held me and said, "You're doing great, baby. I'm proud of you." I began to believe that love had to be earned, that my value only existed in what I could do for others. And my mother, consciously or not, fed that belief every day. Not through words, but through her absence. Her silence became a kind of cruelty I wasn't prepared for. There's a particular moment I remember with painful clarity. I was 14, and we had a science fair at school. I had worked on a project about the human heart. Ironic now that I think about it. I stayed up late building a model, researching data, memorizing facts. I thought, maybe if I win, she'll come. Maybe she'll smile. Maybe she'll remember what it feels like to see me. Just me. She didn't show up. When I came home with second place and a ribbon clutched in my hand, she didn't even look up from the sink. I stood there, waiting, hoping. I said, "I got second place." She nodded and said, "Did you remember to change your brother's catheter before you left?" And that was that. I learned that achievements didn't matter if they didn't serve someone else. That pride was selfish. That recognition was a luxury I wasn't allowed to ask for. So I stopped trying. I stopped hoping she'd see me. I buried the parts of me that wanted to be special, that wanted to be chosen. I told myself over and over that I didn't need her to be proud of me. But I did. I really, really did. The emotional neglect wore me down in ways no physical exhaustion ever could. Because you can sleep off fatigue. You can rest your muscles. But when your heart feels invisible for years on end, the damage is harder to undo. You begin to believe you are invisible, that your pain is ordinary, that everyone must feel this way, and maybe you're just weak for struggling. And yet, despite all of it, I never hated her. That's what makes it so complicated. Because I knew she was hurting. I knew she never asked for this life, that she loved my brother fiercely, that she was terrified every single day. And I thought, maybe if I just keep doing more, being better, she'll find her way back to me. Maybe she'll come out of that fog and remember that I'm her daughter too. But she never did. She built her world around my brother's illness and around my ability to keep everything running. I was the foundation she walked on daily, without ever looking down to see if I was cracking. And I was cracking. Quietly. Slowly. Under the weight of responsibility and unmet needs. There's a difference between being helpful and being used. I didn't know that yet. I thought sacrifice was just another word for love. So I kept sacrificing, even when it cost me everything. When I look back on my teenage years, what stands out most isn't the music or the school dances or the excitement of growing into yourself. It's the silence. Not a peaceful silence, but the kind that presses on your chest. A silence full of things left unsaid. Full of moments I watched pass me by while standing at a window, holding a spoon, a towel, or a bag of medicine. Everyone around me was becoming something. I was becoming invisible. I was 15 when I realized I was no longer seen as a child. Not at home, not by anyone. My mother spoke to me like a partner, not a daughter. Her voice was sharp, always full of urgency, always weighed down by the next thing that needed to be done. His breathing sounds tight. Go check the monitor. Don't forget his 4 p.m. meds. Did you refill the prescription yet? Never once did she ask how I was holding up. I don't think she even saw me anymore, not as a person with needs or feelings or dreams. I had become a function. High school was supposed to be a time of discovery, but while other girls were figuring out who they were, I was figuring out how to manage a feeding pump that kept clogging. While they were staying out late, sneaking into movies, getting grounded for breaking curfew, I was measuring out syringes and reading side effects on pharmaceutical labels. My curfew wasn't set by my mom. It was set by my brother's symptoms. If he had a seizure, I didn't sleep. If his muscles were weak that day, I skipped school without hesitation. It wasn't a question. It was a reflex. And no one at school knew. I kept my head down, did my work, avoided attention. The only time I came close to opening up was during an English assignment. We had to write about the most difficult moment of our lives. I remember sitting at my desk, fingers frozen over the keyboard thinking, how do I explain a lifetime? I ended up writing about a hospital visit from the year before. It was vague, sanitized. When I turned it in, the teacher called me after class. She said, "This was very mature. You must have a strong family." I nodded, smiled, walked out and cried in the bathroom stall for 10 minutes. I never tried to share again. Love, for me, was a quiet ache. I didn't know how to want it because I didn't believe I deserved it. I saw it in movies, in hallways, in whispered secrets between lockers, but it didn't feel real. Not for girls like me, girls who smelled like antiseptic and carried guilt like a second skin. I watched other girls get asked to dances and wondered what it must feel like to be chosen for something that had nothing to do with duty. At 16, I had a crush on a boy named Eric. He was in my chemistry class. He made dumb jokes and had kind eyes. One day he offered me half his sandwich during lunch. I wanted to say yes, but I was afraid of what kindness might feel like. I turned it down. Later, he asked me if I wanted to go to the spring dance. I laughed it off, told him I didn't like crowds. But the truth was, I couldn't imagine myself at a dance. What if something happened at home while I was gone? What if my mother needed me? What if saying yes to something I wanted meant someone else had to suffer? So I said no. And the worst part was, I didn't regret it. I had trained myself to push those wants so far down that they stopped feeling like options. By 18, I was numb to most things that should have mattered. Graduation came and went like a blur. I skipped the ceremony. My mom said we couldn't afford a cap and gown, and deep down, I think she just didn't want to go. So I stayed home and cooked dinner, helped my brother with his physical therapy, and fell asleep watching late-night TV reruns. No photos, no celebration, no acknowledgement, just another day. And then, something strange happened. I got accepted to a local community college. They offered a partial scholarship, enough to make it possible. When I told my mother, her face didn't light up. She didn't cry tears of pride. She frowned. "Who's going to take care of him while you're gone?" That was the first thing she said. I tried to explain that classes were in the evening, that I could still help during the day, that maybe we could get some outside assistance. But she wasn't listening. Her silence said everything. That night, she cooked dinner like nothing had happened. No congratulations, no discussion, just another quiet dismissal. I didn't bring it up again. 2 weeks later, I turned the scholarship down. I told myself it wasn't the right time, that I could reapply next year, that my brother needed me more right now, that I was being selfish to even think about leaving. And everyone around me praised the decision. "You're such a good sister. So mature. He's lucky to have you." Lucky. It's a strange thing to be told you're an angel while you're dying inside, to be praised for disappearing, to be applauded for breaking your own heart in silence. At 19, I got my first job. Not because I wanted independence, but because we needed money for new equipment. I worked at a local grocery store, stocking shelves overnight. I'd come home just before dawn, nap for an hour, then start my day caring for my brother. My mom never asked how the job was going. She just reminded me when rent was due, when the fridge was empty, when the electricity bill needed to be paid. Some nights, I would stand in aisle 9, holding a can of soup in my hands, and wonder what it would feel like to just walk out. Not out of the store, but out of everything. Just start walking until my legs gave out. No phone, no guilt, just freedom. But I never did, because that would have meant abandoning them. And even after everything, I couldn't do it. Because the truth is, I loved my brother. Deeply. Fiercely. He was kind and funny and resilient in ways that most adults couldn't even manage. He never asked for the life he got, and somehow he still found ways to smile through it. He was the reason I got up in the morning. He was the reason I didn't crumble. But that love came with a price no one should ever be asked to pay. I had no roadmap, no one to guide me. I was figuring it out as I went, making sacrifices that became invisible even to myself. And with every passing year, I lost a little more of who I was. Until one day, I couldn't even remember who that girl was, the one who wanted to study, to fall in love, to live for herself. She was buried somewhere under the weight of responsibility, and I didn't know if she'd ever come back. There was a moment, an exact frozen second, when I realized something inside me had changed forever. It didn't happen during a tragedy or in some big emotional confrontation. It was something small, almost silent. I was standing at the sink, washing the same plate I had probably washed 1,000 times before, when I felt nothing. Not frustration, not exhaustion, nothing. Just this hollow, echoing absence where my heart used to live. And that terrified me more than any pain ever had, because pain meant I still cared. Pain meant I was still fighting. But this emptiness, meant I was fading. Not just emotionally, not just spiritually, but entirely, as if I was erasing myself from the inside out. And no one saw it happening. I had just turned 20. My friends, what few I still had, were finishing college, getting internships, falling in love, traveling. They posted pictures from beaches, concerts, new apartments. I scrolled through their lives like I was watching a movie I would never be cast in. My phone would buzz, and I'd already know it wasn't for me. I had stopped replying anyway. I didn't know how to explain why I hadn't come to the party, or why I couldn't meet up for coffee. Eventually, people stopped inviting me. I told myself it was for the best, that I was busy, that they didn't understand my life. But the truth was, I didn't understand it either. My brother's condition had worsened. His muscles were deteriorating faster than we had expected. He couldn't feed himself anymore, couldn't brush his teeth, couldn't roll over in bed without help. I had learned to lift him without straining my back, how to bathe him gently, how to distract him from the pain when his joints locked up. I became an expert in things no sister should ever need to know. My mother, once so alert and controlling, had begun to slow down. Her energy was fading. The stress of 2 decades had finally begun to show in her slumped posture, and the way she now asked me to double-check things she used to do by herself. The roles had reversed completely. She no longer ran the house. I did, quietly, without acknowledgement, without thanks. One evening, while I was helping my brother adjust his oxygen mask, he looked up at me and whispered, "I don't want to be a burden." I froze, because that word, burden, was the one I had never dared to say aloud, not even in my darkest moments. I knelt beside him and grabbed his hand. "You're not," I said, forcing the words through the tightness in my throat. But the way he looked at me told me he didn't believe it. And maybe, in that moment, neither did I. It wasn't his fault. It had never been his fault. But that didn't change the weight I carried. And hearing him say that, so clearly, so sadly, was like a crack in the dam. I wanted to cry, to scream, to run, but I didn't. I smiled. I adjusted his blanket, and I tucked that moment deep inside the drawer where I kept all the other feelings I couldn't afford to process. The drawer was getting full. There were nights when I couldn't sleep. I'd lie awake and imagine disappearing, not dying, just walking away, taking a bus to somewhere far, somewhere quiet. I'd imagine renting a tiny apartment with creaky floors and a view of nothing in particular. I'd get a job at a bookstore. No one would know my name. No one would need anything from me. I could be anonymous, invisible on my own terms. But every time I pictured it, the same guilt crept in. My brother's face, my mother's silence, the weight of obligation pulling me back like an anchor. I could never leave, because what would happen to them if I did? And then, like clockwork, the shame would come, for even imagining freedom. That's what people don't understand about long-term caregiving. It isn't just physical, it's mental, emotional, existential. It changes the wiring of your brain. Your nervous system is always on alert, waiting for the next emergency. You learn to live in a constant state of anticipation, of dread. Even when things are calm, you don't trust it. Calm feels like a setup. I stopped doing things just for myself. I couldn't remember the last time I had read a book, not a medical manual, or listened to music that wasn't background noise while I cooked or cleaned. My life became a checklist, a rotation, a routine of duties that blurred into one another. The concept of joy felt childish, selfish, distant. One day, my old art teacher ran into me at the pharmacy. I was picking up medication. She recognized me immediately, even though I had changed so much. She hugged me, asked if I was still drawing. I wanted to lie, to say yes. Instead, I said, "I don't have time for that anymore." She looked at me with this soft, knowing sadness. "Make time," she said. "Even if it's 10 minutes. Art saved me once." I smiled, nodded, walked away, but her words stuck to me like honey, sticky and slow and impossible to ignore. That night, I found my old sketchbook in a dusty box under my bed. I flipped through the pages, my fingers trembling. Faces, places, stories. There was one sketch I had done of a girl on a balcony looking at the moon. I didn't remember drawing it, but I stared at her for a long time. She looked free in a way I couldn't imagine being. I didn't draw anything that night, but I left the sketchbook on my nightstand, open, waiting, because a small voice inside me, one I hadn't heard in years, was whispering something. Maybe you still exist. Maybe the girl who used to dream isn't gone. Maybe she's just buried, sleeping, and maybe she deserves to wake up. I didn't wake up one day and decide to reclaim my life. There was no cinematic turning point, no dramatic confrontation or heroic epiphany. It began with something so small it almost felt accidental. I bought a pencil, not a fancy one, just a regular mechanical pencil, the kind students use. I added it to the cart while picking up gauze and antiseptic cream for my brother. It cost less than $2, but holding it felt like I was holding permission. Permission to be something else, even if just for a moment. I went home, sat at the kitchen table after everyone had gone to sleep, and stared at a blank page for 30 minutes. My hand hovered, unsure. My chest was tight. I was afraid to begin, afraid that if I tried and failed, it would be one more thing I'd have to mourn. But I made a line, then another, and another. And before I knew it, I had sketched the outline of a girl sitting by a window, knees pulled to her chest, watching the rain. She looked lonely, but there was softness in her eyes, like she hadn't given up yet. I didn't know who she was. Maybe she was me. Maybe she was someone I wished I could be. All I knew was that when I finished, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Alive. It became my secret ritual. At night, when the world went quiet and I had no more tasks left to complete, I would draw. Faces. Moments. Bits of emotions I didn't know how to say out loud. Sometimes I cried while sketching. Sometimes I smiled without meaning to. It was like I was speaking a language only I could understand. And with every page, I was pulling myself back from the edge of invisibility. I didn't tell my mother. I didn't tell anyone. Not because I was ashamed, but because I wanted something that was just mine. Something untouched by responsibility. Something I didn't have to explain. During the day, nothing changed. I still fed my brother, bathed him, monitored every breath he took. I still cooked, cleaned, and managed the household like a ghost running a machine. But inside, a shift had started. A slow reclaiming. A quiet rebellion. That's when I noticed how much of myself had been conditioned to disappear. Simple things, like choosing a new shirt for myself or making tea just the way I liked it, felt strange, almost forbidden. I had spent so long prioritizing everyone else's comfort that I'd forgotten what my own preferences even were. I didn't know what kind of music I liked anymore, what food made me happy, what color felt like me. I had to rediscover those things piece by piece. Sometimes I felt guilty for enjoying them, as if happiness was a currency I wasn't allowed to earn. And then came the day that shattered everything. It started like any other. My brother had a mild cold, so I was extra careful, checking his oxygen levels, adjusting his blankets, making sure he stayed hydrated. My mom had left early for a doctor's appointment of her own. I was home alone with him, just like I had been 1,000 times before. Around noon, he started coughing. I sat beside him, rubbed his back, gave him warm tea. But the coughing didn't stop. His breathing grew shallow. His eyes panicked. I grabbed the suction machine and did everything I had been trained to do. But it wasn't working. I called 911. By the time the ambulance arrived, he was blue around the lips. I rode with him to the hospital, my hand clutching his cold fingers. My entire body was shaking, but I kept whispering that it would be okay, that I was here, that he wasn't alone. When we got to the ER, they took him from me. Just like that. No questions. No time to explain. I sat in the waiting room alone. Minutes felt like hours. I stared at the white tiles on the floor and thought about all the things I hadn't done. Not for me, but for him. I had never taken him to the beach like I promised. I never let him try driving the wheelchair outside on his own because I was always afraid he'd fall. I never told him how much he saved me, how much I loved him. I was still staring at those tiles when a nurse came out and said, "He's stable." I broke down. Not just in relief, but in guilt. Because beneath the terror and gratitude, there was something else I couldn't ignore. I was angry. Not at him, never at him, but at the life we had been forced to live, at the weight I had carried, at the years I had lost, at the fact that it took nearly losing him to realize just how much I wanted more than this. When my mother arrived, she hugged him, cried over him, and barely looked at me. Later that night when we were home, she said the words that would brand themselves into my memory forever. "You're lucky I had you to handle it. I don't know what I would have done without you." Lucky. That word again. I wanted to scream, to ask her, "Do you know what I've given up? Do you have any idea what it's cost me?" But I didn't. I just nodded and said, "I'm glad he's okay." Because even then, I was still playing the role. But something had cracked, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. I began journaling, not just sketching, writing, letting the words spill out of me like water breaking through a dam. I wrote about everything. About being 12 and missing the museum field trip. About being 16 and saying no to the boy with kind eyes. About being 20 and turning down the scholarship. About the anger, the resentment, the love, the grief. It wasn't pretty, but it was honest. And with every word, I began to understand that I wasn't weak for feeling these things. I wasn't a monster for wanting something for myself. I wasn't selfish for dreaming about a life outside of caregiving. I was human. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, that was enough. I never thought I would come to a place in my life where I had to choose between survival and loyalty, between continuing to exist in silence or finally admitting out loud that I was drowning. It wasn't one moment that forced that choice. It was 1,000 little ones, collected over years, buried deep, until they could no longer be ignored. And when they surfaced, they came like a storm. My brother was recovering, slowly. The hospital incident had left him weaker than before. He needed more help than ever, and my mother, still numbed by her own fatigue, relied on me without hesitation. She never asked if I was okay. She never even asked if I had eaten. It was assumed that I would be there, every day, every hour, because that's who I was now. That's who I had always been. But something inside me had shifted. I began to notice things I had trained myself to ignore. The way my mother spoke to me only when she needed something. The way she would praise me to others but never to my face. The way she had built a life that functioned only through my self-erasure. And worst of all, the way she seemed to think this was all natural, expected. One evening, I was sitting in the living room, folding laundry, when she walked in and asked if I could cancel plans with a friend because my brother was feeling uneasy. It wasn't a question. It was an instruction. I hesitated, just for a second, just long enough to inhale, just long enough to feel the anger rising in my throat like acid. "I was going to see Anna tonight," I said, my voice quiet, measured. "We planned it 2 weeks ago. Just dinner." She looked at me as if I had just spoken a language she didn't understand. Her brow furrowed, not in confusion, but in disbelief. "And who's supposed to take care of him while you're off having dinner?" That sentence broke something. Because it wasn't about dinner. It wasn't about responsibility. It was about the fact that after all I had given, after sacrificing everything I had ever wanted, after being the nurse, the maid, the emotional support system, my desire to simply be a person for 2 hours was seen as betrayal. I stood up slowly, folded the last shirt and placed it on the pile. My hands were shaking. My chest felt tight. "I'm not just your backup plan," I said. "I'm not just someone you plug into the gaps of your life." She stared at me, stunned, silent. And for the first time, I didn't fill the silence. I let it stretch, let it hurt. She eventually scoffed, shook her head, and muttered something under her breath. Something about me being ungrateful. And that word, it landed like a slap. Ungrateful. After everything. I left the room, not because I was angry, but because I was done trying to explain my worth to someone who had decided it was conditional. That night, I didn't cancel dinner. I went. And sitting across from Anna, eating pasta in a dimly lit restaurant, I felt awkward at first. Like I didn't belong in the world of normalcy. But as the minutes passed, something incredible happened. I laughed. Genuinely. Loudly. The kind of laugh that bubbles up from your stomach and surprises you. And in that moment, I realized I hadn't laughed like that in years. It was like opening a window in a house that had been sealed shut. I started to go out more, not often, not recklessly, but I gave myself permission to do small things. I took walks in the park. I listened to music with my headphones on. I bought a new sketch pad and carried it with me. I stopped asking for permission. And each time I chose myself, the guilt came. But it came softer, quieter, like an echo instead of a scream. Until one day I was sitting on the porch with my brother. The sun was setting and the sky was painted in strokes of orange and violet. He looked at me, his voice barely above a whisper. "You seem happier," I turned to him, surprised. "Really?" I asked. He nodded. "You smile more now. I like it." It was such a simple sentence, but it undid me, because it reminded me that he had always seen me, not just as a caregiver, but as his sister, as someone who mattered, someone with her own life. We sat in silence for a while, watching the sky shift, and then he said something that I will never forget. "I don't want you to give up your life for me." I felt tears sting my eyes. I looked at him, heart aching. "I'm not giving up," I said. "I'm just learning how to live again, a little at a time." He smiled, and in that moment I felt a weight lift, because I realized that loving him didn't mean losing myself, that honoring his life didn't require sacrificing my own, that I could be both, present and free, caring and whole. It wasn't easy. My mother and I drifted. The tension between us became something unspoken, a quiet war of glances and silence, but I stopped trying to fix it. I stopped trying to earn her approval. I stopped waiting for her to say the things I needed to hear. Instead, I started saying them to myself. I told myself I was enough, that I had done my best, that I had survived things no one ever should have to, and that I deserved more than to simply endure. And as I continued to rebuild my life, brick by fragile brick, I carried the scars with me, not as wounds, but as proof that I had been there, that I had given everything, and that somehow, against all odds, I was still standing, still fighting, still here. Healing doesn't come in a straight line. It comes in fragments. It comes in slow mornings when your chest isn't as heavy as the day before. It comes in tiny victories, like choosing to sit in the sun for 5 minutes instead of hiding in your room. It comes in realizing that for the first time in years, you said no, and didn't apologize after. For me, healing came in moments I never expected. It came one afternoon when I was standing in the grocery store, staring at a wall of cereal boxes. I wasn't there for anything special, just picking up the usual staples, but something about the way the light fell through the window, the quiet buzz of people just living their lives, the calm of it all. It hit me. For the first time in forever, I felt like just another person in the world. Not a caretaker, not a ghost, just someone choosing between Cheerios and granola. And I cried, right there in the cereal aisle. Not because I was sad, but because that feeling, normalcy, felt like a miracle. That's what people don't talk about when they speak of trauma. They think healing is dramatic, loud, obvious. But sometimes it's just being able to breathe in public without flinching. Sometimes it's being able to look a stranger in the eye and not feel like you're taking up space you don't deserve. It was around that time I started therapy. It wasn't easy to admit I needed help. For so long, I had been the helper, the strong one, the dependable one. But there's a unique kind of power in being able to say, "I'm not okay." My first session, I barely spoke. I sat there, hands in my lap, staring at the floor. The therapist, her name was Jean, didn't push. She just said, "You don't have to be anything here, just be." That sentence sat with me for days. You don't have to be anything. Not the strong one, not the savior, not the perfect daughter, just me. And when I finally did speak, it came out in pieces. I told her about the caregiving, the emotional neglect, the resentment I was ashamed to admit, the grief I hadn't even named. Jean listened without judgment. She validated things I didn't even know needed validation. She helped me understand that what I had lived through wasn't just hard, it was unfair. That my love for my brother didn't cancel out the pain I had been forced to carry. And slowly, I began to forgive myself. Forgive myself for the years I had lost, for the choices I had been forced to make, for the anger that still flared up sometimes when I least expected it, for the fact that some days I didn't want to be needed at all. Forgiveness, I learned, isn't about saying it was okay. It's about saying, it happened, and I'm still here. It's about allowing yourself to live without constantly measuring your worth in sacrifice. As I started to rebuild my identity outside of caregiving, I began to notice something else. Resentment toward my mother. Real, raw resentment. Not just disappointment or sadness, but a quiet, pulsing anger that I had tried to bury for years. It wasn't just about what she didn't say. It was about what she allowed me to become without ever stopping to ask if I was okay. About the way she let me carry her burdens without offering to share mine. About the way she had shaped her survival around my silence. And facing that anger was the hardest part, because for so long, I had told myself that she did the best she could, that she was tired, that she was overwhelmed. And all of that was true, but it was also true that she failed me, that her pain didn't excuse my erasure, that she could have tried harder to see me, to love me, to protect me from the crushing weight of being everything to everyone and nothing to myself. In therapy, I learned how to hold both truths at once, that I could love her and still feel hurt by her, that I could understand her and still need distance. That healing didn't require reconciliation, it required honesty. I stopped trying to get her to understand. I stopped explaining my feelings, stopped waiting for her to say she was sorry. And that act of letting go of the need for validation was like cutting a cord that had been strangling me for years. Around that time, I started drawing again, not just at night, not just in secret. I began sharing my sketches online, posting little captions about caregiving, about survival, about the things I wished someone had told me. People began to respond. Strangers from all over messaged me, saying things like, "I see myself in your words," and "Thank you for putting this into language." It stunned me. For so long, I had believed that my story didn't matter, that I was invisible. But here were people telling me that my pain had meaning, that my voice wasn't just noise, it was needed. And little by little, I started to believe it too. I enrolled in a local art course, nothing fancy, just once a week. It felt indulgent at first, but also right. Sitting in that room, surrounded by others who were there to create, I felt a kind of joy I hadn't known in years. I wasn't the best artist. I didn't need to be. I was there. I was present. And that was enough. Meanwhile, my brother continued to decline. He was still gentle, still full of gratitude, still the heart of everything I did. But now, I cared for him without resentment, without erasing myself. I set boundaries, asked for help, took breaks, not out of selfishness, but out of self-respect. We talked more too, real conversations. I told him about my drawings, about the class, about the people who reached out to me online. His eyes lit up. He said, "You should keep doing that. People need to hear you." That meant everything. Because for so long, my voice had been tied to obligation. Now it was becoming something else, something mine. And then, one morning, I woke up and realized I was different, not healed, not whole, but stronger, softer, braver. I no longer moved through life waiting to be needed. I began moving through life wondering what I needed, what I wanted, what I deserved. And for the first time, I allowed myself to answer those questions, without shame, without apology, because I had spent too long being silent, too long believing that love meant disappearing, too long thinking that being good meant being small. But I was done shrinking. I was ready to live. I didn't realize how much of my life had been defined by permission until I finally stopped asking for it. Permission to rest, permission to be loved, permission to exist outside of service to someone else. I had waited for so long, for a sign, for someone to tell me it was okay, for the right moment to begin again. But the truth is, those moments don't come with fanfare. They don't arrive neatly wrapped. They're quiet, fragile, easy to miss if you aren't looking. And often, they start with something as simple as a choice. That summer, I made one. I decided to apply to college again. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, fingers hovering over the keyboard, rereading the application form for the 5th time. My heart was racing, not from excitement, but from fear. Fear of rejection, fear of change, fear that I was too late, too old, too broken. But I filled it out anyway. I wrote my personal statement like it was a letter to the girl I used to be. I told the truth, not the polished version, not the story people want to hear, but the real story. I wrote about my brother, about what it means to raise someone when you're still a child yourself, about how love can coexist with pain, how strength is sometimes silent, and how survival isn't always noble. It's just necessary. When I clicked submit, I cried. Not because of what might happen, but because I had done something entirely for me. A few weeks later, the acceptance email came. It wasn't to a fancy university. It wasn't a full scholarship, but it was enough. Enough to prove that I still had options, that my future hadn't disappeared just because I put it on pause, that my story didn't end in that house. Telling my mother was harder than I expected. I waited until after dinner, when the dishes were done and the house was quiet. My brother was watching TV, his laughter echoing softly from the other room. I sat across from her and told her, carefully, what I had done. She didn't look up. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and said, "And what about us?" It wasn't a question. It was a judgment. I felt that old guilt rise up like a reflex. The need to defend, to explain, to prove that I wasn't abandoning anyone. But I didn't. I just said, "I'll still be here. But I need this." She didn't respond, just nodded slowly, as if I'd told her the weather report. And in that silence, I felt something settle in my chest. A boundary. Invisible, but solid. I wouldn't beg her to understand. I wouldn't ask for her blessing. I wasn't looking for applause. I was choosing myself. And that had to be enough. Classes began in the fall. I took the bus 3 nights a week, clutching my sketch pad and notebook like armor. The first few weeks were overwhelming. I felt out of place among the younger students, some fresh out of high school, buzzing with energy and possibility. But I showed up. I listened. I asked questions. And slowly, I started to feel like I belonged. One of my professors, an older woman with wild gray hair and eyes that saw too much, pulled me aside after class one evening. "You have something," she said. "Not just talent, perspective. You've lived something most people haven't. Don't be afraid to put that into your work." I nodded, holding back tears. Because for the first time, someone wasn't just seeing my pain. They were seeing the power in it. I started creating again, seriously, intentionally. My drawings became bolder, messier, more honest. I stopped worrying about making things pretty and started making things true. I illustrated scenes from my life, quiet caregiving moments, emotional voids, flashes of rage and release. I turned them into a series and posted them online. The response was overwhelming. Messages poured in, people telling me they had lived similar stories, that my art made them feel seen, that they finally felt like they weren't alone. I cried reading them, every single one. Because for so long, I had been convinced that my pain had isolated me. But now, I was watching it connect me. That's when I knew. I wasn't just healing. I was transforming. My relationship with my brother deepened in unexpected ways. We talked more, laughed more. He began asking me about my classes, curious about my art, genuinely interested in who I was becoming outside of the person who took care of him. And I saw in his eyes a kind of pride that no one else had ever given me. Not pity, not obligation, pride. He was growing too, in his own way, accepting help from others, building his own identity, even within the limits of his body. I wasn't the center of his world anymore, and that was a good thing, for both of us. We were learning to love each other not just through dependence, but through presence. My mother, on the other hand, remained distant, polite, but cold. She never asked about my classes, never mentioned my art. It was like she had drawn a line around what she could emotionally handle, and I existed just beyond it. I grieved that, because even as I grew stronger, there was still a part of me that longed for her recognition, for a moment of eye contact that said, "I see you, I'm proud of you." But that moment never came, and eventually I stopped waiting for it, not out of bitterness, but out of peace, because I had spent too long trying to earn something she didn't know how to give, and I was done living my life for someone else's approval. One night, after finishing a class project, a large mixed media piece about the invisible labor of caregivers, I sat alone in my room, staring at it. It was messy, raw, full of anger and love and sorrow, full of me. And I realized this was the first time I had ever made something that was entirely, unapologetically mine. No edits, no compromises, no fear, just truth. And in that truth, I found freedom. I didn't realize it at the time, but the moment my brother passed was the moment the final chapter of one life ended and another quietly began. It was a Sunday morning, ordinary in every other way. The sun had slipped through the blinds and landed across his bed, lighting the room with a softness that felt almost cruel, knowing what it would be overshadowing. I was in the kitchen, making coffee the way I always did, when the phone rang. My mother's voice was flat, hollow, and clipped. "He's gone," she said. That's all. No preamble, no warning. Just those 3 words that unraveled the world I had carried for decades. The floor felt unsteady beneath me. My hands clutched the countertop as if it could anchor me against the storm of grief that hit like a tidal wave. I ran to his room. His bed, once a source of so much care, so much effort, so much quiet heroism, was empty of the life I had been holding on to for so long. And in that emptiness, I felt the crushing weight of 1,000 unspoken words, 1,000 days of sacrifice, 1,000 years of fear. I remember sitting on the edge of his bed, holding the pillow where his head had lain, and finally allowing myself to cry. Not the quick, polite tears I had let slip in the shadows of night. Not the tears of quiet frustration or fleeting sadness. These were tears that belonged to the girl who had been 12 when she first realized she would never have a normal childhood. Tears that belonged to the teenager who had given up every school dance, every late-night sleepover, every glimpse of freedom. Tears that belonged to the woman who had carried the weight of someone else's life, and only now was free to grieve it. The funeral was a blur. Faces I had memorized since childhood looked at me with pity, with sympathy, and even with a trace of judgment. My mother's face was unreadable, a mask that didn't show relief or sorrow or gratitude. She merely stated, in that cold, precise tone that had defined so many years of my life, "If you had been here more often, maybe he would still be alive." I wanted to scream. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell her that I had given everything I had, that I had sacrificed my entire youth and adult life for him. I wanted her to see that no one could have done more, but I stayed silent, because that had been my life. Silence, endurance, obligation. And now, even in my own grief, I couldn't break it. After the funeral, I returned to the house. It felt both familiar and alien. The quiet was different now, empty in a way that had never existed before. No wheezing breaths to monitor, no whispered jokes to catch, no small hands gripping mine when the world felt too heavy. The room was filled with echoes of a presence I had spent every waking moment protecting, nurturing, and loving. And in that silence, I finally allowed myself to feel what I had been too afraid to admit. A profound, aching grief, coupled with a quiet, tentative relief. In the weeks that followed, I found myself sifting through his things. There were letters I hadn't seen before, notes tucked into drawers, scraps of paper with childish handwriting. One in particular caught my eye, hidden in a notebook beneath the bed. It read, "Thank you for loving me. Thank you for never leaving my side. One day, live your life too. Love, always, me." I sat on the floor, holding that page, and I cried again. Not just for him, but for the years of my life that had been paused, for the moments of joy I had postponed, for the dreams I had silenced to keep someone else alive. And for the first time, I realized that love could coexist with release, that holding on too tightly was never the measure of devotion, that survival, and finally living, was a gift I owed to myself as much as I had owed to him. I began to take small steps, each one trembling and uncertain. I returned to my sketchbook, letting the pencil flow freely, filling pages with the chaos of memory, the tenderness of care, the sorrow and the humor of a life shared. I enrolled in courses I had once thought impossible to pursue. I began reaching out to people who had shared similar experiences, connecting, learning, understanding that my story was not unique, but its truth was invaluable. And slowly, painfully, I rebuilt my life. Not to erase the past, not to forget my brother, but to honor it. I painted his laughter, his quiet courage, his stubborn resilience into the corners of my everyday. I allowed myself to dream again, to hope, to imagine a world where I could exist fully, grief and love intertwined, strength and vulnerability coexisting. There are moments still, years later, when I stand in his room, now quiet and still, and I speak aloud, even if no one is there to hear. I did my best. I loved you. I survived. And I know he is listening. I know that the years of sacrifice, the tears, the laughter, the whispered secrets, they weren't wasted. They were the foundation of everything I have become. Life has returned to me in waves of light and possibility. I smile more freely now. I laugh without guilt. I make choices that are mine, not dictated by obligation. And while the ache of loss never completely leaves, it has softened into something bearable, even beautiful, a reminder of the depth of my capacity to love and endure. To anyone who has given everything for someone else, to anyone who has silenced their own dreams to keep another alive, I want to say this: you are seen. You are enough. Your sacrifices are not forgotten, even if the world fails to notice them. And when the time comes to reclaim your life, to breathe, and to create, and to be wholly yourself, do not hesitate. The love you have given, the life you have nurtured, it is a light that will guide you, even in the darkest of nights. And in the quiet spaces where grief and gratitude meet, I whisper a final thanks to my brother for every laugh, every small triumph, every lesson in resilience, to my mother for the imperfect ways she showed love and survival, and to myself for enduring, for choosing, for finally stepping into a life that is mine. Thank you for witnessing this journey. Thank you for carrying the weight of someone else's story with me, for understanding that love can be boundless, sacrifice profound, and survival a quiet kind of triumph. In the end, I learned that the heart can break 1,000 times, yet still be capable of hope, of joy, of life, and I am living proof.